Good evening. Again, I have to apologize for my cold. Hopefully I can push through here without having a coughing fit like Hillary Clinton. Have you seen her on some of her speeches? Drudge keeps acting like she's about to die or something. I assure you I just have a cold. It's a wicked cycle. I preach my brains out, it messes up my throat, I get a cold. Then I preach my brains out. And but after this, actually, I've got a couple weeks to recuperate. So thanks. How many are here that were not here yesterday? Ooh, the majority, actually. So let me do a little basic recap just to sort of catch you up. Yesterday, last night, what we did is we really just sort of walked through, if I were to summarize it, I'll just say we walked through a basic teaching which lays out the Israel centricity of the Bible. What do I mean by that is whenever we approach the Bible to try to understand what is it teaching about this very difficult matter called the end times, we have to begin by understanding the context of this book. And so what happens, and this is a universal issue, is let's say you're an American and you do what I did actually when I first got saved. The stupid little stoned out punk from South Boston is I think I was actually, because I was reading it before I got saved, I think I was smoking weed as I read, but I opened the book, and where do you open? The book of Revelation. Don't do that. And so often what happens is we turn to some of these more difficult apocalyptic prophetic books, and immediately we see all this symbolism, and it's just the natural thing for humans to immediately read our context into the pages of the Bible. And so we're like, oh, well, is this must be talking about, I can't tell you, I'm going to make a joke here, I can't tell you how many times I've written some article or something, it gets posted on some news site, and how just the comments are like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. Everyone knows the Antichrist is Barack Obama. And I'm just like, my mind flashes to Monty Python when, she's up in the window and she's like, he's not the Messiah. He's just a naughty little boy, It's like, no, he's not the Antichrist. Like, one much, much worse is coming. But we just do this. Christians have done this down through history. You'll get some guy in the medieval period, some earl in some county somewhere in Europe, and he's pointing at the duke next door. This guy's the Antichrist. And it's like, no, he's not the Antichrist. And we just tend to read our little worlds into the pages of this book. This book is and always has been thoroughly Jerusalem and Israel centric. So there is, I hate to offend Mitt Romney or whoever, but Jesus is not going to return to Salt Lake City. That's not how it works. He is returning to a specific city. It's called Jerusalem. And so the story largely revolves around Jerusalem and Israel, and it's not to say that we're irrelevant, not at all. It's just that the geographic context of the story is not primarily focused on the United States. And that upsets us, and we say, well, wait a minute. The Bible is, we as Americans, we're sort of just intuitively disbelieve the world revolves around us, but it doesn't. We could say, well, we're the most powerful nation in the world, this, that, most powerful economy, most powerful military, but that does not mean that God's world revolves around us. The story revolves around Jerusalem. So once we understand the basic context of the Bible, and it's very, very simple, then the point tonight I want to shift into, the title of this message is Understanding the Islamic End Time Paradigm. Now, as I said last night, I was trying to touch more on heart issues before we jump into sort of unfolding the specifics regarding the end times. And again, I'll reiterate what I said last night. In Matthew 16, Jesus, he rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees. He actually rebukes them, and he says, listen, you guys know how to interpret the signs in the weather. Because you have the saying, and I grew up actually as a son of a fisherman. We used to say, red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky at morning, sailor's warning. And Jesus actually quotes that. That's a saying that goes all the way back to those days. So as a 5-year-old kid, I looked up at the sky, and if the sky was red, I was like, I'm going fishing with Dad tomorrow. You know, and it was like I could understand, these are easy things, how to interpret the signs of the weather. And he rebukes them, and he says, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. And so oftentimes you'll get sort of these guys that are on the other side of the other extreme, and they say, oh, don't waste your time studying biblical prophecy. It's a big distraction, this, that, and the other thing. And they'll say the last thing you should do is ever try to relate the events in biblical prophecy to events that are unfolding in the earth. And they'll say that's newspaper eisegesis, where you're trying to read the newspaper into the Bible. Well, this is true. You should not try to read the newspaper into the Bible, but the bottom line is if we are indeed living in the last days or approaching the time that the Bible defines as the last days, then yes, we will be able to look at some of the words of the prophets, and all the more so as we approach that final day, and look out in the earth and say, this is that which the prophets spoke of. Because the words of the prophets are not detached from this world. And Jesus actually expected the scribes and the Pharisees to be able to interpret the signs of the times, i.e., ultimately he was pointing to himself, the fact that he was the one that was spoken of by the prophets. And so really these are the two times in history when the church, when the believers will be able to do that, is we'll be able to, in the first century, look at the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and say, oh, this is the guy that they were talking about. But also in the last days, we'll be able to say, oh, this is that which the prophets were speaking of. And so Jesus expects us to know the signs of the times. But what I said last night is, but guys, let's, in terms of all of the, these end time prophecy conferences and such, I go to a lot of these events, and everybody wants to know the secret code and the mystery of this and the mystery of that and unlocking the secret mystery of whatever, and they want to know what's next, and they want to hear from the next guru. And it's important for us to study and understand as Bereans, to come together and to chew on the biblical prophecies. But listen, the main focus needs to be on the return of Jesus and the age to come. He wants us to understand and study the events that precede his coming, but our overwhelming burden and majority of our focus needs to be on the age to come. And a large percentage of that world that's studying biblical prophecy is just endlessly obsessed with the events that precede his coming, the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, all of these things. So we need to be careful not to become overly focused on those things, but also not go the opposite extreme and just say, this stuff's just for the kooks and the wackos, and let's not deal with this. No, he does want us to deal with it in a responsible, level-headed manner. So with that said, so that was sort of all my qualifiers. Now I'm going to jump into, thank you, Delta, for the peanuts. We're going to go ahead and jump into to try to better understand the events that precede the coming of the Messiah, the events that precede the return of Jesus. And I want to discuss this issue of what I call the Islamic end-time paradigm. So if you've been studying biblical prophecy, reading books on popular prophecy books over the past 40, 50 years, you would know that the majority teaching, and it's really not only just in the past 50 years, but I'll kind of qualify this in a minute. You've read that we are looking for a revived Roman Empire, right? And there are certain prophecies that people will point to say that we would see a revived Roman Empire in the last days, out of which would come the Antichrist. Now, the idea of the Antichrist coming out of the Roman Empire, this goes back to the earliest days of the post-apostolic writings, the early church writers. They were looking at the prophecies in the book of Daniel, and they believed it was pointing to the Roman Empire. Of course, they lived under the shadow, under the authority and the rule of the Roman Empire, and so it was quite natural that they would assume that this, again, their worldview was that which the prophets spoke of. But later, after pagan Rome essentially dissolved, then the interpreters started slowly looking elsewhere, until the Reformation, when all of the Protestants then began looking back to Rome, except now they were saying it's the Catholic Church. And so this was sort of no longer was it pagan Rome, they were looking at the Catholic Church and then saying we're looking for a revived Roman Empire. Because the writings of the early church, they weren't looking for anything revived. They were just looking for the Antichrist to come out of the Roman Empire. Then it dissolves, and then, we kind of tack into the wind, if you will, and sort of modify our views and look at the scriptures afresh. And they started saying, we're going to see a revived Roman Empire. What I'm suggesting is that the few texts in the scriptures that have been looked to by Christians to claim that the Antichrist would come out of a Roman Empire have actually been misinterpreted. And when you look at the writings of the early church, most specifically, they did say that the Antichrist would come out of the Roman Empire, but they specifically, when they discussed geography, they pointed to the Middle East, the section of the Roman Empire that was in the Middle East. I believe they had that component right. I believe they had the component that says it was a revived Roman Empire wrong. And so I want to look at the two primary pillars, the two primary texts that have been supporting this idea of the Antichrist coming out of the Roman Empire. And why are we looking at this? Because Jesus expects us to look at these things. And I believe that when we look at them and when it comes together, we can look out in the earth and say, my goodness, the prophets were right. It's actually coming to pass right in front of us. And when you plug in this Islamic paradigm into the words of the prophets, everything just comes into clear focus. And you go, wow, this is actually real. Like the prophets actually did foresee these things, and they are coming to pass. But in order to come to those conclusions, it's not just an issue of pointing to the political or theological boogeyman of the day, because this is often what people say, well, Islam's the boogeyman of the day, and so it's only natural that Christians would just start pointing at Islam. That's really not the issue. The issue is that, again, just to reiterate, the Bible is about Israel. It's about Jerusalem, and it's about the nations, because the prophets repeatedly refer to and name names, name tribes, peoples, nations that surround Israel. They are every single one of them, every single one of the prophecies throughout the prophets that name names of the peoples that are judged in the context of the day of the Lord. That's the return of Jesus. Every single time, multiple times, they are Middle Eastern and North African Muslim majority nations. There's not a single reference in all of Scripture that it names let's say, a European nation being judged in the context of the day of the Lord. That doesn't mean the whole world's not going to be judged. It will. What I'm saying is that we need to emphasize that which the Scriptures emphasize. And if the prophets are repeatedly pointing to this part of the world, then we need to very seriously consider, why is the Bible emphasizing these nations in these parts of the world that surround Israel? So all we're doing is articulating a biblically contextualized understanding of the end times. We're just looking at a different sort of version, of different telling, a different story concerning the end times by beginning with this idea that it all begins with Jerusalem. It's very simple. So, an introduction to the Islamic end time paradigm, the two passages that are most often looked to support the Roman view are Daniel 2 and then Daniel 9, verse 26. We're going to begin with Daniel 2. So Daniel 2 is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. Again, if you've read the prophecy books, everybody has their sort of drawing of this statue, and you can see a million different versions of pictures of this all over the internet, and everybody loves to do their charts and this sort of thing. But basically, this is the story of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and he had this dream, and it disturbed him greatly. And in the dream, he sees this great statue, and Daniel, who was among the Hebrew exiles, was well known for being a man of wisdom and for having the gift to interpret dreams and understand mysteries and this sort of thing. And so Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he's upset, and he calls all of his wise men and his astrologers and so magicians, and he says, okay, guys, I want you to tell me what my dream was. I want you to give me the interpretation of my dream. And they're like, okay, tell us the dream. He's like, no, I want you to tell me what the dream was. And they're like, we're dead. Because if they fell down, if they failed, this was, when the king calls them before him, it's not a room like this. He's sitting probably, 20 feet up imposing, and they walk up, and the whole thing is set up to be incredibly intimidating. And he's set up there almost like a demigod, and they're like, you know, who can do this? And then they go, oh, wait, we have an idea to save our hides. There's this guy, Daniel. Let's punt to Daniel. And so they're like, hey, we got a good idea. We know one of these guys among the exiles, Daniel, he's gifted. Let's call him. So Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel, and he gives him the challenge. He says, I want to know the interpretation of my dream. I want to know the dream itself. Daniel says, King, I know the God of heaven and earth, and he reveals mysteries to men. He says, let me sleep on it. So Daniel sleeps on it. The God of heaven and earth reveals it to Daniel. And this is where we pick up the story. Daniel is standing before King Nebuchadnezzar. And in verse 31, he says, you, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. The moment he said that, the king was like, oh, he got it. You know what I mean? I mean, you know, in a second, he had the king's attention. There was a single great statue, and that statue was large and of extraordinary splendor. Nebuchadnezzar's pulse just started racing. He was like, oh my goodness, he is a prophet. So here's this large statue. It was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. Verse 32 to 33. And then Daniel starts explaining that this statue is made up of these various metallic elements or components. He says the head of that statue was made of fine gold. So the head is made of fine gold. The breast and its arms are then made of silver, a different metallic component. Then the belly and the thighs, so going down to above the knees, are made of bronze. Then its legs were made of iron. So you have 4 so far. And then it has the 5th sort of division. Its feet are partly of iron and partly clay. They're a mixture of iron and earthen clay, you know, probably hard clay, but brittle. And he says, you continued looking until the stone, he sees the stone, it's cut out of a mountain. It doesn't really say. The stone was cut out, not with human hands, but by divine providence. This rock is cut out, and it strikes the statue on the feet, specifically on the feet of iron and clay, and it crushes the feet. So this great rock comes and it strikes the statue. And then he says this, then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all of it were crushed all at the same time. And they became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind just blew them away. So, I mean, the thing is just pulverized, and the residue, just the chaff is just blown away and nothing's left. The statue is just decimated. The wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. On the other hand, the stone that struck the statue, it becomes a great mountain, and it fills the whole earth. So this is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. So Daniel first tells him what he saw, and then he begins to give him the interpretation. Now here's just, again, a particular picture. I'm not sure if this was in a book or I pulled it off online. But traditionally, this has been the interpretation. Daniel goes on and he explains to the king, he says, you, O king, are the head of gold. And so, you know, the first component of the statue is the head of gold. That's the kingdom of Babylon. And then he goes and he says, but after you will come another kingdom. It will succeed you. And history tells us that the Medo-Persian, the Medes and the Persians, they succeeded Babylon. That was the next kingdom that replaced Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And then you had the belly and the thighs of bronze. And again, the next kingdom that came and conquered the Persian, the Medo-Persian Empire, was Alexander's Macedonian Greek Empire. That one came from Europe, and it swept all across the Middle East. And then the legs of iron, and virtually everyone has said, well, the next kingdom in history is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire then came out of Europe and sort of replaced much of the Alexandrian Greek Empire. And therefore, they would say that the feet are a last days revived Roman Empire. So essentially what they would do is in between the feet and the legs, they would say there's been roughly a 1,500-year gap. Okay? So you have the legs of iron, the historical Roman Empire, depending on when you say that was dissolved, sort of various opinions as to when that fully took place. But then in the last days, this empire would be revived, and the Antichrist would rule over that. And then the crushing rock is the kingdom of God. This is the return of Jesus. And so when Jesus returns, he will crush the kingdom of the Antichrist, and all these other empires would be destroyed. Now again, I am going to argue that the legs of iron do not represent the historical Roman Empire. Rather, they represent the historical Islamic Empire. Now, I'll just give you one example of how a Western reading of this text immediately has an objection, because we go, Joel, we all know that the Roman Empire succeeded the Greek Empire, right? That's just a matter of history. Again, that's true if you're in, let's say, Israel or Lebanon, but if you're in Persia, there was a different kingdom that emerged. And so it's all, because we as Westerners largely trace our history through the Roman Empire, again, we assume that God traces history through a Western lens. But the dream was given to who? Nebuchadnezzar. And it was concerning a series of kingdoms that would defeat and conquer and replace his. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, there was a very brief period in AD 116 when the Roman Empire came down under Emperor Trajan and it conquered Babylon. And then Trajan had a sunstroke and he withdrew. But in terms of the roughly 1,500 years that the Roman Empire existed, it didn't really replace and crush the Babylonian Empire. It took parts of it, but in terms of the heart of the Babylonian Empire, and most certainly the Persian Empire, as we'll see, it was not the kingdom that replaced. There was another empire, the next major empire that emerged. First you had sort of, I'll say, a diluted, extended version of the Persian empires. You had what were called the Parthians, and then the Sassanids. These were just Persian peoples that sort of ruled that region. And the Parthians, by the way, were a great empire that the Romans could never defeat. But the next major empire that came, and really was the next one, was the Islamic Empire. In the 7th century, burst forth out of Arabia and quickly conquered the entire Middle East, sweeping all the way across North Africa, even up into Europe and Cordoba and that whole area in Spain. So we're going to go ahead and just look at, because the bottom line is, these are the only two potential candidates in all of history. These are the only two empires that we can look at to say which one is the fourth kingdom of Daniel 2. There's no other options. Because it's interesting that Daniel 2, it never mentions, it actually names, within Daniel's prophecy, it names Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greece. But it never names the fourth kingdom. It just calls it the fourth kingdom. So what is the fourth kingdom? Again, we have these two candidates, and we have to look at the history of these two empires and say which one aligns with the biblical descriptions, which one aligns with the biblical criteria. And so the first verse, which I think is so critical, we've already touched on it, but is verse 40. It says, "The fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. It is inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything." In other words, iron is stronger than gold. Iron is stronger than silver. And so, when I was a kid, we used to play a game where we would make a card of Legos, and then your buddy makes one, and you just smash them into each other and see which one lasts longer. Well, if you were doing that, if it was iron versus gold, iron wins. Iron smashes everything else. And he says, "Inasmuch as iron breaks and shatters everything, like iron that crushes, that kingdom, the fourth kingdom, will break in pieces and crush all the others." What are all the others? Well, all the others are Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The fourth kingdom, this is, probably the clearest description, the clearest criterion laid out within the text, is that this fourth kingdom would be the one that crushes Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. So now we have to say, did the Roman Empire crush Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece? Or did the Islamic Empire crush Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece? So let's begin with a map of Babylon. And sort of what I've done here is just kind of sloppily, I put a dot right in the center on Babylon. This is the geographic epicenter of the prophecy. That's where Nebuchadnezzar was when he had his dream. That's where Daniel was. And then I just drew a big circle around it. That's just sort of several hundred miles around the heart of where the dream came. And then the blue area is the Babylonian Empire. This was the dominion of Nebuchadnezzar. This was what the Lord said, a kingdom's coming that's going to replace yours. And so then, of course, the next map is the Persian or the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persians swept out of the east, just to the east, basically modern-day Iran. I know I had to put up the maps because just as Americans, we tend to be very illiterate when it comes to the map. It was something crazy of 80% of college students couldn't even point to Iraq on a map. I was like, we've been in war with Iraq for 10 years, and kids getting out of college, they don't even know where it is. They're like, is it here? You're like, no, that's Indiana. And they're like, what about here? No, that's California. And they're like, oh, that's where Kim Kardashian's from. So you have this Medo-Persian Empire sweeps across and it obviously crushed and replaced, as it said in the text. After you is coming another kingdom, and it will crush your kingdom. It will conquer your kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, if he is sitting there, he's going, yes, this is definitely the kingdom that replaced mine. This is very relevant to Nebuchadnezzar. Then we go to the next map, the Greek Empire, coming from Macedonia, which is over here, basically the modern-day Balkans, which is Bulgaria and Greece, and the country called Macedonia and Serbia and all these others. That's where even the most geographically literate get confused. You're like, I forget the difference between Slovakia and Slovenia and Serbia. And you're like, you are forgiven. But out of Macedonia, Alexander swept across, and with lightning speed, historically, it was just unprecedented, and crushed the Persian Empire. And so really the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire were very similar. It went all the way over to the Hindu Kush, to modern-day India, massive empire. Well, then you have the Roman Empire. And all of a sudden, everything shifts west. Now, you guys remember Sesame Street when you're kids, where they would break up the screen and it would go, one of these kids is doing his own thing. And so there'd be like three kids, how's it go? Is not like the other. There'd be like one kid throwing a ball, another kid like with a football, another one's whatever. And then there's this kid with a rope, or something, which one of these kids is not like the others. The Roman Empire is unlike the others. It is largely a European empire which extended into the Middle East. All of the others, the heart of them is really here. Of course, again, Alexander came from Macedonia, swept all the way over here, and then died immediately, and the thing was broken up. But this is really the epicenter. Now, you can see this is the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Now, actually, it extended, as I said, under Trajan. He came down the Euphrates and the Tigris, and he came down and reached the ruins of Babylon. And it was ruins. And so Trajan wanted to become the new Alexander. He was thinking, I'm going to push this all the way in. Now, the Parthians, again, the Persian peoples, the Parthians that ruled this whole area, they basically practiced a form of guerrilla warfare. They were archers, they were nomadic, and so what they would do, it's kind of like the Kurds today, if you're familiar with. When an enemy came in, they would just back up and withdraw. The Romans would establish their little garrison, and then they would just start picking at them, and very quickly they said, we can't sustain this, and they would withdraw. And basically, so Trajan came down, he established a couple garrisons, just as Providence would have it, he had a heat stroke, or at least that's what most historians say. He withdrew and died, so literally for a couple months. So not a couple, but for several months, Trajan came down, he took Babylon, he withdrew, and then Hadrian, who was Trajan's general, succeeded Trajan. He said, from now on, this is the first, and it actually came more like up over here. It hugged that west coast of, the Mediterranean, and they said, we're just going to leave that to the Parthians, because the Romans could never defeat the Parthians. It was the one empire that they never could defeat. So sometimes you'll go on the internet and it'll say the Roman Empire at the time of its greatest extent. This kind of area was called Armenia, the province of Armenia. This was called Babylon. It was held, again, if you look at the empire itself, it existed arguably for 1,500 years. A few months it took Babylon. You go, would the Roman Empire have been clearly the fourth one to Nebuchadnezzar? And he would go, well, I mean, you can kind of sort of shoehorn it in and go, well, yes, but not really. It really didn't crush Babylon. Now, when we go to the historical Islamic Empire, down here you have Medina and Mecca. See what I just did? That's for two. But what happens is people, they'll get me on the internet and they'll be like, see that? Joel is clearly working for the Illuminati. Someone actually did this whole montage, because I talk with my hands, and they get all these screenshots of me doing these things, and they're like, he's a pawn of the Illuminati. And somehow I'm also a pawn for the Zionists, like the Vatican, all of it together. It's all working together. But anyway, Medina, and then down here was Mecca. And out of Mecca, we won't get into the whole history, but comes forth this guy named Muhammad. He has this clearly demonic encounter with this being in a cave. It demands of him to recite, and he says, I can't do that. I'm not one of these ecstatic poets, and it's crushing him, and he believes he was demon-possessed. He believed it was a demon. And he's trembling. After the third time, the spirit's crushing him and coming over him, and it says, Iqra, recite. And the third time, he allows the Spirit to start speaking through him, and he allows the words to flow out. This is the birth of the Quran. He goes back to his wife, Khadijah, who's 15 years older than him, and he says, I'm demon-possessed, he's suicidal, and she says, no, honey, you're not demon-possessed, you're a prophet, go with it. And this is literally, that's according to the Islamic history, and that's how Islam was birthed. And so for 30 some odd years, Muhammad's career was largely centered around conquering the Arabian Peninsula. But as soon as he died, his successors, the caliphs, just burst forth out of Arabia and very quickly, like lightning, just conquered the whole Middle East. And so you say, between the Roman Empire and the Islamic Empire, which one crushed Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece? And again, you can say, well, did the Roman Empire do it? And you go, sorta. Maybe, maybe you could say about a quarter of it. Did the Islamic Empire crush all the others? And it's like, absolutely, there's no question about it. History, the maps don't lie. This is unarguable. So what I've done here is just sort of go to the next map. I've just thrown up a map. These are the Muslim majority nations of the world. Again, I put Israel in there, the apple of God's eye. This is the throne of David. This is where Jesus is returning to set up his kingdom. This is the location where the king, this is the launching pad whereby God is going to bless all the nations of the earth. This is the geographic location where the law will go forward from the Zion, and the knowledge of God will finally cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. This is the platform whereby God is going to redeem all of creation. And it's right there at what Ezekiel refers to as the center of the earth. Now, does Satan know Bible prophecy? Yes, very much so. And, it doesn't take the discernment of a log to look and go, for the past 1,400 years, Satan has been surrounding the throne of David. He has been extending his spidery fingers throughout the nations, expanding his doctrines. And now listen, I have to qualify this. I am a critic of Islam, but we are called to love Muslims. So I just have to say that before we get into this. This can easily be misconstrued. It doesn't matter what deception Satan has someone under. We are called to love them. Because the bottom line is, as I said last night, every single one of us at one time, if we're not Jewish, somewhere in our family line, the Lord intervened and opened up the eyes of some pagan. And in my case, I was really the first one in my family. And it was because of his mercy. It wasn't because I was like awesome. The Lord was like, man, this guy's really good at selling drugs. He deserves to be saved. No, that's not how it works. He just said, I'm going to have mercy on this idiot, you know. And the Lord chose the weak and the foolish things of this world to shame that which is wise. And then he calls us to acknowledge who we are, that we're in this because of his mercy, and then say, now, Lord, have mercy on them. You know, because we claim to proclaim the gospel of mercy. And then when someone comes along and we don't want to love them, we go, yeah, except for them. No, it's the more reason that we have to be upset and fearful and angry, the more that we're called to love them. But the point is this: Satan has birthed a religion. He birthed a religion. Guys, look, again, you look at the story. Muhammad's in the cave. He's fasting. He's praying. He's part of this pagan ritual called Ramadan. All the pagans did it. And he's out in the cave, he's fasting and praying. The spirit comes over him. It's crushing him. It's choking him. He thinks he's going to die. It demands of him. By the way, I'll just say this. When he says, Iqra, recite, that's where we get the word, like in Arabic, it's Quran. It's the recitation. Essentially what he was saying, because Muhammad goes, I don't know how to Iqra. I don't know how to recite. In Arabia at that time, they were called... we would call them ecstatic poets. They were poets who would allow spirits to channel and speak through them, and they would do Arabic poetry. And so I just have to throw this out. You know, in modern times, like, you know, you got Beyonce, right? And she's a pastor's daughter, but she says she allows Sasha Fierce to take her over so she can dance. You know, and you've got all these now, these musicians that are like, it's like the hip trendy thing to say, I let some spirit take me over. It's basically kind of what was happening. And Muhammad hated them. He didn't like him. He goes, I'm never going to be like one of them. And then after the third time where he thinks his life's going to be choked out, he allows it to start happening. And so it was not poetry. Well, it was poetry. The Quran is Arabic poetry, but it was, he claimed to be prophetic poetry. So you have this, and what are the most essential foundational doctrines and beliefs in this whole book? God so loved us that he sent his only son. God loved us so much that he sent his very heart into the earth. You know, the scriptures say his son, you could say his very essence, into the earth, and he took on flesh. And then what does the Quran say? Far be it from God that he should have a son. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there that disagree with historical biblical faith. The Quran is the only book which is largely dedicated to railing against the most foundational, central beliefs of the historic Christian faith, naming it by name. The Christians call Christ the Son of Allah, the Son of God. In this they but imitate what the unbelievers of old used to say, how Allah's curse rests on them. You know, I mean, it's repeated multiple times. It doesn't take a tremendous amount of discernment to recognize that what was birthed in the 7th century right there and has spread throughout this whole area, it is at its very foundation, doctrinally and practically anti-Christ. Look, guys, you know, as Protestants, we've been infected with so much, you know, after the Reformation, you're the great whore. No, you're the great whore. You know, and all of this sort of Catholic, Protestant back and forth. Once you categorize somebody as the embodiment of evil, it's really difficult to have a conversation with them. You know, and so, you know, as Christians, there's kind of remains this, look, and I'm a Protestant. I agree with some of the protests of the Reformation, so to speak. I agree with the ideas that came out of that. But that's, you know, Protestants and Catholics, we can have dialogue. We can talk. But because of so much of the Antichrist pointing that has happened down through the years, we're so divided. And the bottom line is, I'll just say this. Right now, the past few years, June 2014, coming out of Syria and sweeping across the Middle East, who are the majority of the Christians that are dying for the name of Jesus? Catholics, Chaldean Catholics. You know, and so like you can say, well, this denomination, we disagree on this issue, or we have issues that we disagree with over here. But that's very different than saying, denying the incarnation of God in Christ, denying the Trinity, denying the fact that Jesus ever died on the cross. All of those things in the Quran. And then saying that bottom line, if you don't submit to this, well, you know, it's kind of a mixture, and then throwing in the beheading and all of this kind of stuff. And then throwing in this demonic lust to possess the land of Israel, to possess the throne of David. All of the telltale signs of the Antichrist system are right there, right in front of us. I know I'm just barely just touching on a few things. But the point is this, is globally as Christians, we need to come together and recognize that we have a common enemy, and it's Satan. And unfortunately, Satan does have many very willing vessels who are willing to be puppets for his purposes. And as a result, many of our brothers and sisters are being slaughtered all over the world. And we don't, you know, just say, well, that group's not part of my denomination, so I'm not going to support. They're giving their lives up for the name of Christ. And again, even if they're under that demonic deception, we're still called to love our enemies. Okay. So Daniel 7, I'm just going to touch on this briefly. Daniel 7 is the chapter that deals with the 4 gruesome beasts. This is a reiteration of the same revelation that was given in Daniel 2. The 4 components, the 4 divisions, if you will, of the statue are reiterated through different symbolism in Daniel 7. We're not going to get into all that, but the 4th beast of Daniel 7 is the 4th kingdom of Daniel 2. What does it say about the 4th beast? Because it's given us further insight into this kingdom. Because this one is a vision that Daniel had. Daniel says, after that in my vision I looked, and behold, there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims, and it trampled underfoot whatever was left. So first it comes through and it devours, and then whatever is left, it tramples the residue with its feet. And so this is the picture that the Lord is giving of this 4th kingdom. And not only does it crush Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, whatever it crushes, it erases, it devours. There is a complete destruction, annihilation, eventually, in its wake as it moves forward. So now as we look at this description of the 4th kingdom, we say, does this fit the Roman Empire? And what a lot of the commentators will say is they'll say, clearly the Roman Empire, they had these brutal legions, this brutal military, they crushed rebellions, they crushed resistors. Look, in the Roman Empire, the Roman armies were fierce. But all things considered, the Roman Empire was largely a very tolerant nation-building empire of the ancient world. This was not a lawnmower. This was a revenue collection vacuum. Okay? This is what the Roman Empire was. They expanded their power all over the world so that the wealth of the nations could come back to Rome so that they could get fat and lazy and, you know, engage in all of the ungodly acts that they became famous for before they collapsed. I'll just put it that way. The Roman Empire, after they conquered peoples, is famous, is known of all of the ancient empires. It is known for adding specifically infrastructure, adding law, adding order, adding roads, adding aqueducts. Now again, the roads were just there so that the money could make its way back to Rome faster. But that's what they did. They created order in order to bless and, you know, build up the economy, again, so that they could eat their food and then throw it up and then eat some more and you know, party back in Rome and then outsource their military and do all of these things. And there are numerous parallels to the Roman Empire and modern American culture in terms of where we're going. The Roman Empire allowed its conquered subjects to maintain their language. Now, not all of them could maintain their religion. Many of the ancient religions had this exception. So Judaism, for instance, had an exception. It's an ancient religion. They were allowed to maintain and practice Judaism. So long as those that didn't have this exception, they basically tip the hat to Caesar, make a sacrifice to Caesar, and pay the revenue. Then they received all of the benefits of what the Roman Empire added. And much of the Roman Empire, by the way, was actually overwhelmed by Greek culture. Rather than crushing Greece, actually, much of Greek culture actually overwhelmed the Roman Empire. They weren't really a major cultural imperialistic force. They basically just embraced and adopted the Greek gods. And so Jupiter becomes Zeus and so on and so forth. And they didn't come and say, forget your Jupiter, now Marduk, or, like a new god. No, they actually just sort of adopted the Greek gods. And so during the first century, skip forward to the picture, during the first century, of course, as we know, Judaism flourished in Jerusalem. And the Romans were very proud that they allowed this temple to sit there and for the Jews to practice their religion under. This was a demonstration of how forbearing and tolerant they were. And so Judaism was largely freely practiced. Again, there was the imposition of the heavy taxes and so forth. Now, as we compare that to Islam, I've just got a map here. This is sort of the various phases of the early conquests of Islam. And so, again, Muhammad conquered Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, but then his successors burst forth, and you have the orange. And then within a very brief time, this is all in 130 years, swept all the way over, all the way up into Europe, extending even up into France. And then actually, after this, through the Ottoman Empire, they expanded all the way up into Europe, throughout all the Balkans, all the way up into Ukraine, above the Black Sea. And they were this close to, they made it to the gates of Vienna, right? They were that's Austria. They were close to conquering Europe even. So within 4 years after Muhammad died, okay, so now again, which one between the Roman Empire and the Islamic Empire meets the criteria, the descriptions of the crushing empire that devours whatever's left? Within 4 years after Muhammad died, 1/3 Christians were slaughtered. The next 10 years, 1 million Christians. In ancient times, these are big numbers. When you read the Arabic sources, the Arabic history, you read what's called the Sirat Rasul, the biography of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq. You can get a translation today, a guy named Alfred Gulam, or Julam, I'm not sure how you say. This is the history of the conquests of Muhammad's successors. And you go through all of this stuff. This is not Christians trying to say all this terrible stuff. This is Islamic history. Imam al-Waqidi has a book called The Conquest of Syria. And you go through and you list the cities that were just decimated. When the Muslims burst forward, they weren't trying to do what the Romans did, which was conquering people and then say, give us money. They would literally besiege and level a city. They would raze it to the ground. They would march sometimes 30, as much as 50,000 women back to Mecca to become slaves. In less than one generation, the ancient heart of Christianity, of Christendom, was crushed by Islam. So all of the ancient, great missionary sending capitals of ancient Christianity, of Ephesus, of Antioch, the 7 churches there of Revelation that were in Turkey, Jerusalem, Alexandria, they were crushed. And what were these once strongholds of the ancient church were now struggling minorities. And then you move forward, you push forward 1,300 years, and you look at, what was this struggling minority of Christians, and now we're watching it on the news as the residue is trampled under the beast's feet. And wherever Islam spreads, it always has been a culturally crushing force. And this is because of the doctrines that are inherent in Islam. And again, I have to be so careful here to not make it sound like I'm bashing Muslims, but it's the nature of Islam. You look at Europe, you look at England, they'll come in, and the thing of it is the West, we are so we've been hamstrung by a couple generations of moral and cultural relativity. We're taught to be ashamed of who we are and our culture and so on and so forth. And you combine that with the fact that we are largely a Judeo-Christian culture, at least the foundations, and thus we are a confessional culture. We believe in confession, confessing our sins and repenting and humbling ourselves. And we are now colliding with a culture which does not believe in confession. You know, whenever there's a political conflict, the Muslim leader with some Western leader, the Muslim leader will never say they're wrong. They'll never apologize, ever. And our president will go out and apologize. We're so sorry. And they do see that as a sign of weakness. And they're taught in their book, the Quran says, you are the best of people. You have the best book. You have the best prophet. You have the best religion. And they're actually taught, according to the prophecies, that it's their divine destiny to conquer the world. And they have this incredibly culturally confident, religiously confident, attitude, and they come against the West, and we're all just like, we're so sorry that we're so imperialistic. And look, we're not perfect. The American history is not perfect. Far from it. What we did with the American Indians and with slavery and all these things are real. But the bottom line is, when you compare the principles that we may not always live up to them, but when you look at the principles that are enshrined in the Constitution, the principles that we are trying to strive for, at least claim that we're trying to strive for, of equality, of civil liberties, of all of these things, of freedom, and you compare that to the ideas that are enshrined in Islamic law, Sharia, where again the value of a woman's testimony in court is half that of a man's. In Islam, if a woman is raped, this is for real, if she is raped, there has to be either 2 men or 4 women that were personally witnesses, and not from a distance. Like, it has to be like 4 women witness this in order for the man to be prosecuted. We can easily look, anybody who understands basic human rights can say what we have is far superior. Now, the danger is when we start talking about regaining cultural confidence, regaining a sense of cultural superiority. What everyone hears is they hear, because we've been trained, we hear racial superiority. It has nothing in the world to do with racial. It has to do with saying the principles of equality, of freedom, of liberty are superior to the principles of Islamic law, because they're rooted in men that were trying to articulate principles that they understood from the scriptures. And to say, no, we have confidence and we will stand for these things. But we don't. We roll over. And so we have an incredibly weak culture that's clashing with an incredibly confident culture. And so, you get a group of whoever, there's one hamlet in England, in London, called Tower Hamlets. And within just a very short time, you had this massive Bangladeshi population that came in, and they only made up roughly 20%, but they quickly, took all the positions, the majority of the counselors in this Next thing you know, St. Mary's Courtyard, the sign gets ripped down, and now it's Abu Ali Park, and something Martyrs Square, and historical names are removed, and all these Anglican churches then become mosques. And so wherever Islam has gone historically, it erases, it destroys. And we can go, oh yeah, well, the kings of Israel, they destroyed the altars of Baal and this sort of thing. And Muslims can justify, yeah, we're just getting rid of unbelief, of the residue of paganism. But we don't think that our churches are pagan, do we? They're not. And so this is just the nature of Islam. Wherever it goes, it crushes, and you give it enough time, and eventually it erases and eliminates. It describes that description of the crushing beast to a T. And so just in the past couple years now, that struggling minority of Christians in the Middle East is now far less than half of what it was just 2 years ago. Just 2 years ago. Now, for clarity, the story is not over. We read the stories in the news, and we go, Christianity in the Middle East is wiped out. No. Satan's moved in with his army, ISIS. God knew that he was going to do that. And the way that the church actually always overcomes Satan is the same way that Jesus overcame Satan. We overcome through being overcome. It's completely counterintuitive. We overcome this world by laying down our lives. We're part of this completely inverted, inside out, upside down framework, where if you want to be exalted in the age to come, you humble yourself now. If you want to defeat and overcome death, you lay down your life and die. And so in the midst of all that's unfolding right now, you have people that understand these principles, and they've rejected the American gospel, which says you can have your cake and eat it too. Glory now and glory in the age to come. No, the scriptural model is embrace the cross now and inherit immortality and blessings in the age to come. And it's not to say he doesn't bless us now. My life is far more blessed now than when I was a drug addict, don't get me wrong. But it's not all about inheriting all of the blessings of everything now. We are to imitate Jesus, and it says Jesus himself, for the joy set before him, he scorned the shame, but he embraced the cross. And we're called to imitate him. Over and over and over and over again, Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, let him take up his cross. And basically, what he was saying is embrace martyrdom. It's not saying we don't go looking to get killed. We're not chasing martyrdom. But we're not primarily looking to preserve our lives either. We're looking to save as many along the way as we can. And it's through that the church being overcome will explode. And Satan's so frustrated. But the more that he tries to put it out, the more that a new fire starts over here. And that's happening. And at the end of this session, I'm going to share a video. Not this session, but tonight I'm going to share a video with you. So what time did I actually start? Did I start 5:30? About 5:30. So how are we going to do? Are we going to do a little break and then shift into it? How you got? How many? Raise your hand if you have to go to the bathroom. No. Why don't we do? I tell you what. I was going to get into Daniel 9. I'm not going to go there because I'm kind of involved in all this teaching. Let me just wrap up this session, say this, and then we're going to take a little break and we'll come back and I'm going to shift into a completely different message. But let me just wrap this up by saying this. We just barely looked at Daniel 2 and sort of the descriptions of the fourth kingdom. We just touched on it. And we're kind of going back and forth. The Roman Empire, the Islamic Empire. There are actually several very important indicators in the text. Everyone points to the Islamic Empire. They really do. It is with great, it's with a shoehorn that we make the Roman Empire fit. But it's with great ease that the Islamic Empire fits. I fully believe that empire that Daniel spoke of, that said it would be, and I do believe in the idea that something would be revived in the last days. I believe that right now the Islamic Empire is reemerging right in front of us. It's rising right in front of us. And that which Daniel spoke of, that which the prophets spoke of, is right in front of us. We've been waiting, we've been taught by a lot of the prophecy teachers that suddenly, just out of nowhere in the last days, some new religion's just going to take over the whole world. It never works that way. You know, Oprah's just going to send out an email, and everyone's going to be like, sign me up! Yay! Rob Bell! Or whatever. But it doesn't work that way. Religions take generations for people to embrace a new religion. And I'm absolutely convinced that Satan has been expanding his doctrine, his religion throughout the nations for the past 1,400 years. And it's right in front of us, and it's surrounded the throne of David, and it's now because of, I believe, divine providence. And by the way, I'll say this, I'll make this comment just to upset everyone. I committed my life to the Islamic world shortly after I got saved. It was a very simple Pentecostal meeting where this missionary came, and he had been working in Kazakhstan, and he explained that the Islamic world is the part of the world that it's the most unreached part of the world in terms of the gospel. And this is where we are sending the least number of missionaries. And he said, this is where we need people, but we're sending everyone to Hawaii. And instead of going, and understandably, and I knelt down and I said, I felt the call, whatever that was, I felt it, and I knelt down and I said, Lord, I used to, whatever, I've had a hard life, and at least I thought I did. It certainly can be a lot more hard, but I said, up until now I've had a hard life, and you saved me from hell. And if this is where you need me, I'm going to do it. So I committed my life to the Islamic world. But by and large, here we are 25 years later, and the number of missionaries that we're still sending is tiny. Is tiny. I believe that the Lord is using the crisis of the Middle East. We haven't been reaching them. He's bringing them to us, whether we like it or not. Is it going to have problems socially and terrorism and all? Yeah, it will. They're not all terrorists, guys. I'm the Islamic Antichrist guy. No one's going to accuse me of being naive about Islam. But I'm telling you, they are not all terrorists. The majority are not. A lot of them are little kids and families that are fleeing radicalism. Will there be a percentage that will be terrorists? Yeah. Will it bring crime? Will it affect a demographic shift in Europe? Yes. But I believe that we need to see it as an opportunity. Hey, look at it on the bright side. You don't have to move to the Middle East to reach Muslims because they're here. And if you think like me, how did you say it, John? Some people eat to live, others live to eat. I look at it this way. And don't get me wrong, I love Mexican restaurants. But we've got plenty of them. I'm excited for some Mediterranean restaurants. You always have to look at the bright side. But the Lord's bringing them to us. I think it's a catastrophe what's unfolding. But we have to reach them with the gospel. It doesn't matter what you think about it. We're called to reach them with the gospel. You can vote for whoever you want and hope that this happens, and don't get me wrong, but I'm as cynical as can be when it comes to politics. There's some things that are sort of outside of my hands. Yes, I'll vote. Yes, I'll be responsible. But there is something that I can do, and that's share the gospel. And that's the most powerful weapon that He has given us. So let me wrap this session up, and we'll take a potty break. I say 10 minutes, which means it'll be 15. We'll come back, and we'll jump into the final session. All right.